Let me try to introduce our speaker for today. Her name is Amelia Isacksen, and she's a senior at Norrix High School. She was an intern with the Conservation Biology CTE program through Carissa and the Nature Center. I guess that's why Amber's here today. In her internship, she studied environment racism, tree equity, and the intersection of climate change and social issues. In her talk, she will cover her research and the history of environmental injustice in Kalamazoo.
Okay, I will share my screen. Okay, so as I was already introduced, my name is Amelia Isacksen, and I was in the Conservation Biology CTE through the Kalamazoo RISA program. And over the past 2 years, I conducted 2 independent research projects over my time with the CTE. And so I kind of combined those two to come with this presentation today. Last year, I focused on environmental injustice in housing and specifically redlining in Kalamazoo. And then this year, I kind of looked at the long-term effects of that, as well as community-based solutions to the issues that I learned about last year. So let's start off with kind of setting the scope of what I'm going to be talking about today. So first of all, we want to define environmental injustice. We want to have a common definition to be able to talk about these issues. So we'll define that. We're going to talk about the history of discrimination. Particularly, this will be at the city level, the community level. For Kalamazoo specifically, we will talk about the broader nationwide scale, the broader impact of these, looking at some studies about specifically tree equity and some more up-to-date information. And then we're going to look at how this happens, what causes these inequities, and what we can do about it. So environmental injustice is defined as the disproportionate exposure of communities of color and low-income communities to pollution, as well as its connections to effects on health and environment, and the unequal environmental protections and environmental quality provided through laws, regulations, and governmental programs. So this occurs through discriminatory government policy, which we'll talk about with redlining, inaction in times of crisis. We can look at Flint just in the past decade, as well as just a general disproportionate number of people of color who experience adverse health effects of the climate crisis. It can manifest in a few different forms, but these injustices impact communities' lives in all aspects, from education to medical care to quality of life. And so then we can talk about the history behind why we see these discrepancies before we dig into some data. So one of the main reasons that vulnerable communities are subject to environmental inequity is because of a history of discrimination, particularly in housing. So today we're going to look at Kalamazoo's history of housing discrimination and redlining. Redlining can be defined as a discriminatory practice that consists of the systematic denial of services such as mortgages, insurance loans, and other financial services to residents of certain areas based on their race or ethnicity. When we look at the history of discrimination in Kalamazoo, it dates all the way back to the 17th century. In 1860, the colored school opened as the only option for Black children in Kalamazoo, and this resulted in a highly concentrated number of Black families living around this institution. So 95% of the families of color were living around this school just due to ease. But through the early 1900s, as the federal government started to emphasize homeownership for American families, many working class people ran into the issue of being able to afford homeownership versus renting. So FDR was primarily responsible for implementing 2 agencies, which we'll talk about today, but his programs were the first real government intervention in assisting Americans in becoming homeowners. From 1935 to 1941, the FHA, which is one of the organizations that we'll talk about, the Federal Housing Administration, they held a series of mortgage clinics. So people could come in and they could talk to these government officials about how can I get a government-backed home loan? How can I become a homeowner? As this kind of initiative was being pushed. As well as the FHA, there was also the HLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and they came to Kalamazoo specifically in 1937 and created a map of Kalamazoo by color, ranging from red to blue and class A to D. So they were primarily based on proximity to racial minorities, these color grades. This is an example of Kalamazoo's. It's a little bit pixelated and blurry, but you can kind of see the scale from green to blue to yellow to red. And this was created by the HLC, like I mentioned. And their job was kind of to decide what areas, what neighborhoods were deemed worthy of home ownership and worthy of these government-backed loans from the FHA. It had 4 grades. Red was deemed the worst and deemed unworthy of homeownership or government-backed loans, and ranged up to green, which was deemed most desirable, highly eligible. The government wanted their money in those families. They wanted to be backing those homes. Red marked areas had the highest percentage of Black people living in them. At this time, African Americans only made up about 2% of the Kalamazoo population, but all but 2% of Black families were in these redlined areas. Areas were yellow lined. This is the next grade. It's also C. So yellow is C, D is red. Areas were yellow lined if Black neighborhoods were too close to them. So sometimes it was proximity, or if white immigrants were present. So yellow areas were places like the Vine, or what's now known as the Edison area. And it was marked yellow because of the presence of Black families, and specifically Hungarian families were primarily the white immigrants in Kalamazoo. And the FHA also went out of their way to redline specific families. Only 17 African American families in all of Kalamazoo were not redlined, but all of these families were still yellow lined. Here's one example of that very specific redlining that we can see. So this is Peeler Street, and Peeler Street had 4 Black families living on this street. And they were surrounded by all other white families. And we can see that only the homes of the Black families were redlined, and all of the others were yellow lined due to their proximity to these redlined homes. These maps also caused many historically Black neighborhoods to deteriorate in size. Before redlining, we can look at this specific block. This is from the east side, and we can see that each of these little spaces here as a family or a household is what they're counted as. And before redlining in 1932, there were 67 families living on this specific block. And after just 20 years of redlining, we can see that 23 remain. And today, in this specific block, there's only 4 homes, only 4 residential spots that are still occupied. The rest are abandoned lots or open space. A lot of them are industrial areas, and they're largely abandoned. So this is seen continually through areas of Kalamazoo, and this also led to an increase in dilapidated housing in these concentrated redlined areas. So Black neighborhoods often fell into disrepair as the community kind of turned a blind eye to their disrepair. Black communities began complaining in 1930, right before redlining, about some structural issues that were arising in these neighborhoods. For example, the plumbing and the sewage systems. But the city, especially as redlining continued, the cities denied these requests and often condemned their property for the issues that they were asking about. These conditions continued to worsen all through the city, but mostly in redline neighborhoods. There were housing codes that were passed, and a slum removal project destroyed 350 homes that were all primarily in redlined areas. By 1960, 50% of African Americans were living in dilapidated housing in Kalamazoo. And then because of that, a lot of these areas became subject to gentrification, where once the area has been neglected for so long that it's largely abandoned, it goes through this process of urban renewal. So areas are bought up for cheap, redone into new housing or businesses, and this often will raise rent and makes the area too expensive for those who had historically lived there to continue living there. Redlining also spurred a wave of white flight. So as white families wanted to be part of these desirable neighborhoods, they wanted to be involved in these loan programs. They would move out of these neighborhoods. So in the north side in particular, of all the white people on North Rose Street in 1957 or 1937, 52% left to blue and green line neighborhoods over the next 20 years. And they were able to move out of these undesirable areas, unlike people of color living in these neighborhoods. And this was because of racially restrictive covenants. So these were legally binding and enforceable, and they were written into the deeds of the homes themselves. They prohibited the occupation of African Americans, and this was a tool specifically used by the FHA to kind of keep their blocks sectioned off, and it's baked into the home loan industry of America. This was across the country. This is an example from a deed in a West Edge Hill home. And they often covered whole lots as well as the homes themselves. And 85 to 95% of homes were covered by these in the peak of the FHA's influence in Kalamazoo. As we continue to move up the list, we can talk about blue linings. This was the B class. Being blue line meant you were able to get federally backed home loans. Specifically in the Eastwood neighborhood, 2 decades of blue lining tripled the number of houses from 52 to 154. West Nitch Hill was blue line mostly because it was restricted, as we talked about, meaning that African-American people could not occupy, own, or lease the home. And it's still one of the whitest neighborhoods in Kalamazoo today. And we can also look at the highest rank. This was green lining, ranked A and seen as most desirable for homeownership and loan eligibility. We can see the counter side of white flight. Where are they going to? And it was here. So from after 1937, in the next 20 years, the number of homes went from 171 to 236. Again, we want to emphasize just how specific this process was. At the corner of Parker and Merrill, which is this intersection of these streets here where this little red box is, we can see that it's really close to this green lined area up on Long and Short Road. And so this was a specifically Black family that were employed. They were cleaning people for the people who were living on Long and Short Road at the time. But you can see how this specific home is redlined. All the ones around it are yellow. But once you get into this upper area here, we have green lines. The Fair Housing Act wasn't passed until 1968. This specifically outlawed racist deeds on houses, but redlining itself as a term or as a practice wasn't outlawed until 1979 specifically. It's still happening in America today. It might look a little different, but it's still very present. There's legislation passed to dissuade it, but multiple studies have shown that Black and Hispanic borrowers are still more likely to be denied mortgages and be offered higher priced mortgages. And we'll continue to talk about this, but these issues are not just about where people live, but we can look at the health issues that are caused by these things as well. So we can look at the solid metrics that are used to kind of identify these lasting effects. Inequity can be a difficult thing to quantify, but there are a few organizations that have tried to put numerical scores, who have tried to put solid metrics to these effects. So the ones we're going to look at specifically today are going to be what's called an EJ score, an environmental justice score, tree equity, and we'll also look at air quality as well. So we're going to start with environmental justice scores. When we want to look at the environmental concerns and disproportionately affecting these marginalized communities, one way to familiarize ourselves before we look at some maps is to look at the breakdown of an area by race. So this is just each of the neighborhoods that we could see on those previously redlined maps. This is each of their number of non-white residents. And we'll compare that to, we just want to keep this in mind, generalize ourselves. So we want to keep this in mind as we begin to look at these maps, look at these metrics. So in 2022, a team of researchers led by Paul Mohai at the University of Michigan developed an environmental justice screening tool to identify the areas that were most highly affected by environmental injustice in Michigan specifically. The scores are calculated using a combination of factors. So they look at economic, political, and social disadvantage, and it's on a scale of 1 to 100. Kalamazoo's north side specifically is ranked in the top 10 areas for the highest EJ scores in Michigan. They also have a tool in which you can look at how they break down into individual metrics. So this is the overall score. We can see where the majority race key overlaps with the most red areas on the map. But you can also break it down by income. So we want to notice again here, where are the red areas? And then this is another one based on race. So we want to look at where the darkest areas are here. And then we can compare that to other factors. For example, we can look at air quality. So this visual shows specifically Kalamazoo's north side, which is where the air quality is worse in all of the city. It has a higher percentage of low-income residents and a higher percentage of people of color, and a lower air quality than not only the national average, but also just other areas in Kalamazoo. One reason for this is the Graphic Packaging International plant, as well as the Kalamazoo wastewater plant. Air permits were approved for these recycling facilities about 6 years ago, but a presentation done by Dr. David Ansel in 2022 showed that the residents of Kalamazoo's north side had higher rates of hospitalization for asthma than other city neighborhoods, and over 150 households in the area ended up joining a class action lawsuit against Graphic Packaging specifically in 2022. The Kalamazoo Mill has 12 violations since 2010, including 8 odor code violations, and it is in the top 100 toxic air polluters in the country. And this also affects toxic particulate matter. So this is, again, one of the breakdowns by this EJ tool. So if we want to remember these map based on income and the map based on race, and then we can see how these things start to overlap. All these metrics demonstrate a pattern. The lower income areas and the areas with higher percentage residents of color are experiencing these adverse effects at a higher capacity. We can look at also, they have more social statistics as well. This shows life expectancy. They have a lot of really interesting tools in places where it's more relevant. They have ones for flooding and other things that are going to become far more prevalent, specifically on the coastal America, about kind of when we think about climate change and how extreme weather is going to start to affect these communities more and more. We can also see examples of this across Michigan. In 2021, local officials in Benton Harbor ended up replacing thousands of lead pipes in the area. Testing over the past 3 years had shown lead levels at least 50% above the federal action level. Benton Harbor is 85% Black and the poorest city in Michigan based on per capita income. 11,000 pages of emails and records showed clashes between state and city officials over the lack of progress made. Since 2018, Benton Harbor received over 160 violations of water safety regulations. In 2021, they finally began the process of replacing all of the 4,400 contaminated pipes. Residents were not provided with safe bottled water until early 2022, and so 40 to 50% of city residents were drinking the city water anyways during this process, despite recommendations made by officials. And then one of the most famous instances of a water crisis in Michigan is obviously Flint. The city of Flint is 55% Black, 66% mixed or other race. And in 2013, the Flint water supply was switched to come from the Flint River in a part of a budget cutting costs methods. But the river water wasn't treated to guard against corrosion. And so in these pipes that were not coated with things to protect the people, it caused lead and other contaminants to leach into the water. Flint residents immediately started complaining about the change. Their water was orange. They were sending emails, they were calling officials, but state officials dismissed the concerns, issued a series of false assurances. There was no sense of urgency. And even after tests reflected contaminants, a lot of decision makers were questioning the test validity rather than the water's safety. Many people and residents questioned if the response would have been the same if the crisis had occurred in some place like Birmingham or Ann Arbor or East Grand Rapids, where there's a majority white population. So after all my research about the overall effects of these things, I set out to find out how we can have implement solutions at a community level. Continuously in looking at past examples, I found clashes with government and seeing that it can be a struggle to appeal at that level. And while it's important to lobby and it's important to try and make legislative change, it's empowering to communities to know that they can implement solutions themselves. So I take a look at this measure that we talked about called tree equity in my search to see how we can make a difference. So tree equity is the goal of having enough trees in every neighborhood in the United States for everyone to experience the social, economic, health, and climate benefits that a healthy canopy provides. The score is on a 1 to 100 point scale, and it was created by an organization called American Forests. And it's designed to measure how well the most critical benefits of an urban tree canopy are reaching those who need them most. The lower the score is, the greater need there is for investment in healthy green spaces. And their score takes into account multiple factors, including building density, average income of inhabitants, racial demographic, and more. So you can put in your zip code for this. And there's that. But I found Kalamazoo's. And we're doing pretty good. I feel like we're a pretty green city. We got lots of trees. We got lots of green spaces. But it also has a breakdown, like I talked about, of population, people of color, people in poverty, unemployment even. And you can also break it down and graph-wise. So you can see on each of the axes, you can have tree canopy coverage by percentage, and then number of or percentage of people of poverty and percentage of people of color. And generally, we want to see, we want to observe these trends, and we can see that generally speaking, as the percentage of people in poverty increases, the tree canopy decreases. Same with percentage of people of color. So while Kalamazoo clearly has some room for improvement, but we're doing okay, our shortcomings pale in comparison to other cities across America. One place that this tool specifically was piloted in Bridgeport, Connecticut, it was found that the poorest blocks in the area had 54% less tree cover and were found to be 5 degrees Celsius warmer than other areas of the city. There's also data showing that there's 38% less tree cover in communities of color, and this can lead to up to 13-degree Fahrenheit hotter temperatures. And as we start thinking about the climate crisis and the future of our communities, we want to best equip these communities to be able to combat higher temperatures, as we're having record highs just last summer, and I'm sure more to come this summer. And additionally, green spaces and higher tree canopy coverage are linked to lower crime rates, better mental and physical health. And it's been found that specifically when we talk about our conversation with redlining, we kind of start to see how these two factors intertwine. We can look at previously where these areas that were previously ranked A through D. Now we can look at where how they're doing in tree canopy wise with this tree equity tool. So it's been found that areas that were previously ranked class D, or those that were redlined due to high populations of minorities, they have a tree canopy cover of around 23%, compared to in areas that were previously ranked class A or previously green lined, they were 43%. Additionally, in urban areas, redlined neighborhoods are 2.6 degrees Celsius hotter on average than non-previously redlined areas. The A-graded areas also have roughly twice the overall vegetation in comparison to previously D-ranked areas, which creates not only, we can see this long-term significant disinvestment in the prosperity of minorities, but many of these areas still are struggling with decline in home ownership, home value, employment, health, etc. One study that I looked at showed a comparison of 7 different major cities across the US, Baltimore, Maryland, Los Angeles, New York, Philadelphia, Raleigh, Sacramento, and Washington. And researchers looked at median income data, racial demographic, education level, and mean tree canopy percentage. And they found that across the board in all these cities, a higher median income meant higher tree canopy coverage. Again, we see that in cities with high minority representation, like Sacramento or LA, there was a pattern of low tree canopy coverage in neighborhoods of high minority inhabitants. It's been found that residents in previously redlined areas have less access to public investment in green space. And one study noted that the populations of trees that were found in the majority minority areas are also far less biodiverse and 9 times less likely to have old growth trees in viable planting sites, and a 60% chance of a smaller tree in a viable planting area in a degraded area versus an A-graded area. So when we're looking at the health of these forests that are existing, basically what this study showed is that we're seeing less biodiversity, we're seeing less opportunity, where there's opportunity for old growth forests, they're not there in these previously degraded areas. And then there's overall there's less trees, there's less flora, it's not where it should be. And one of the things that is often run into when you're looking at a lot of these bigger cities is that it's hard to know how to implement green spaces in an already really dense, overcrowded urban area. Overcrowding in space is already a struggle for a lot of these communities. But one way that researchers have sought to combat this issue is by exploring condensed green space options. So what I came across in my research is microforests. So a microforest is a small, dense, biodiverse forest designed to flourish in urban spaces with little land and a need for accelerated growth. So this is a little snapshot of a pamphlet that I made as part of my research project this year. It is part of a greater trifold. There is a third and there's also a back, which is just summarizing kind of what I learned about microforests. I am printing, well, I have them all printed, and they'll be going at some trailheads across Kalamazoo to kind of have a little bit of a community outreach portion to this project. But I'll summarize what I talk about in these and the importance of microforests, where they come from, and how they're accessible, how people can make them themselves. So microforests have become increasingly prevalent as researchers continue to contemplate where sustainable green spaces have a place in already really crowded areas. It was created by a botanist named Akira Miyawaki, this kind of strategy, this idea, and he theorized on how to increase biodiversity through small but highly dense forests, specifically created for degraded land. So when we think back to our conversation about redlining, and how there is often abandoned spaces, industrial spaces, for example, in the East neighborhood that we talked about, that would be a great spot to put a plot of a microforest. It's designed to be put in a place where the soil isn't necessarily the most rich. It's not necessarily surrounded by other green space. He theorized that to have a flourishing forest, there had to be 4 layers: a main tree species, a subspecies, shrubs, and ground covering herbs. This strategy also uses local methods of soil enrichment. Upon the forest creation, there's kind of a 3-year time period where you're highly involved, the community is highly involved in tending to the forest, but after that point, it becomes largely self-sufficient. Another thing that this strategy emphasizes is the density. So seedlings are planted 3 times as densely as a commercial forest, and this close growth method allows for a simulation of competition. So we're basically looking at a regular natural forest. We want to look at a thriving natural forest, and we want to mimic this in a human way on a faster and smaller scale. Microforests are also amazing, not only due to their size, but they're accessible. You'll be able to create them in an accelerated time period, and it is something that communities can do and enact themselves. So I'll talk briefly about how to create your own, just to give some general steps, but there's so much information out there about how to make your own. And there's a whole, the Miyawaki method, it's a whole culture of people. This is specifically, I looked at some pilots of this in Thailand, where they had great success in a very crowded area in implementing this strategy. So one of the main components is you want to make healthy soil out of not so healthy soil. One of the main points of this is incorporating biomass. So you incorporate straw or composted fruits and vegetables into the soil, and this is making this not so great soil into something that can allow soil microbes to flourish, and it's going to mimic those found in the naturally surrounding areas. You guys mentioned, or we talked earlier a little bit about native planting, and that's a huge part of this method. One of the first steps is looking at a successful and a healthy tree stand near where your planting site is, and taking note of what species are doing well there, what native species are doing well there, and you want to procure seedlings from those species that are doing super well in a nearby plot, and you want to put those in yours. So you want to take a look at some grasses, shrubs, pioneer species, climax species. And as we mentioned before, the accelerated growth process of this is bypassing some of this succession. So you plant all the species at once in order to make it look and behave like a natural made forest. Again, you're planting these seedlings super densely. So it's 3 to 5 seedlings per square meter and 5 seedlings for every 10 square feet. Another super important step is with keeping the soil health. You cover the soil in mulch specifically for the first 3 years, so that the soil microbes are not exposed to sunlight, and it helps it to survive through winters, which is particularly important in Michigan, and allowing moisture in the soil not to evaporate as much because of this mulch. Again, there's a lot more steps to this. It's easier than I think a lot of people would think. There was a 10 video like prep course that I looked at to see, like, is this actually something that I could do if I wanted to in my community? And while it does take, especially in those first 3 years of growing, it does take great care. They really emphasize the idea that this is a community project. It's like a community garden, but it is providing this, it's starting to work towards this tree equity. Microforests are 30 times more dense and grow 10 times faster and are 100 times more biodiverse than a monoculture plantation. And again, urban forests are providing a number of benefits, including moderating climate, improving air and water quality, and it also reduces energy use by nearby buildings, sequesters carbon, and overall enhances the health and social well-being of nearby communities. One study done in Baltimore County found that a 10% increase in tree canopy was associated with a roughly 12% decrease in crime. And another study from Philadelphia done in 2018 showed that increased tree cover had a correlation with fewer cases of gun assault, even citing that the decreased temperature effects that more heavily tree-covered areas experience can help to keep aggression levels lower. One study from Philadelphia found that a 5 to 10% increase in tree coverage would also result in over 271 fewer heat-related deaths per year. So when we start to look at, again, we want to be thinking about the future. We want to be setting up our communities to be enabled against climate change. This is a tool that's going to be really important, and it's going to help to benefit these socioeconomically disadvantaged areas. Again, we can also see effects on mental health. One study from London, UK showed that areas with more urban trees had lower depression rates compared to areas with fewer urban trees. As well as human health. There's a lower prevalence of lung cancer, lower prevalence of asthma, specifically among children associated who are raised in areas with higher tree density. And obviously, green spaces are just one solution to a small part of a much greater issue. While these issues are, they were created by redlining, they're created by environmental discrimination. They're still prevalent, they're still happening. We can do so much to help. There's already progress being made. Just earlier this week, the New York Times had an article that came out that was talking about the South Bronx, where 94% of residents are Black or Hispanic, and the poverty rate is twice the city's average. But they were talking about these new expansive mapping and data collecting efforts that were helping to kind of shed light on the socioeconomic issues, specifically with things that were related to climate change, looking at flooding, looking at wildfire, et cetera, and how this is beginning to increase in these past years. But these tools is one of the great steps that we've been able to see coming, and the community has been able to use this data to create initiatives like tree equity projects or awareness, using it as a concrete data to point to and lobbying for funding. The first step is really spreading awareness and advocating for change. So we can encourage investment in vulnerable communities. We can put pressure on our lawmakers. We can implement solutions at the community level in our own backyards. And though it can feel really overwhelming, I think, especially as a young person, it can be overwhelming to think about having to change generations-long patterns of discrimination. But it's possible if you come together with a community and continue to ask the hard questions. So thank you. That's my presentation. I have my sources on the next slide and they go further, but I will keep it on this beautiful picture of trees instead.
Anybody have any questions, you can raise your hands. Steve?
Yeah.
First, very impressive body of work for, I don't know how much time you spend in that class, but this is really important stuff. So thank you for doing it. I had a couple of sort of detailed questions about tree coverage.
Okay. I'll do my best.
Yeah. And well, first, how do we get our hands on some of your brochures?
They will be, so I just got them finished printing. Amber was able to get them to me just like 2 or 3 days ago. So they should be at Asylum Lake, the trail there. They should be at Celery Flats. I'm trying to get them at the front desk at the KNC as well. But they will, in the next 2-ish weeks, they will be available at those spots particularly.
So is there any work on what the minimum size of a microforest is to achieve the benefits that you list? You know, is one tree a microforest? I think not, but you know, what are the are there, do any of the studies look at that?
Yeah, generally, the minimum size requirement is going to be about 10 by 10. In
10 by
the
10 meters?
yes, 10 by 10 meters.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, the most important thing is kind of it's less about space itself and more of density of this. So you are having these all the layers of a regular forest. It's just going to be in
Yeah.
this condensed area.
Right. Right. Eventually they'll work themselves
Yes,
out.
it works
Okay.
its magic.
And so in the uh tree coverage maps, I'm I I'm a little, I guess, um I'm curious how they're measuring tree coverage. Is it number of trees per unit area, or do they actually measure the spread of the canopy,
Hmm.
and look at how much say within an acre, how much of that acre is covered by green at the peak of summer or something like
Yeah.
that?
Yep. So it is actually done by the canopy cover. It's done with overhead satellite images.
Okay.
And a lot of it is actually citizen science like sourced. So they take these
Okay.
images, they put them out. I did some of it as part of this as well. It's a little bit tedious. There's they have a website where you basically they put the image on the screen and you go through and you click on every single tree that's in the image, and it gets passed through to their like next higher level where then they do the measuring of how much of this is green space that's covered. And they do the more in-depth part of kind of measuring that. But the initial sorting process of, as you can imagine, hundreds of satellite images. Some of them
Sure.
have no trees in them. And so part of it is the citizen science portion, which is you look at a picture, it's a picture of the ocean, and you say no trees. And then you go next one, there's a city, but there's one here. Click on it, send it through.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating. So, and remind me, who is doing the higher level stuff? Is that the Forest Service?
It's called it's a organization called American Forests.
Uh-huh. Just a,
And
it's an independent NGO.
yes.
Well, I want to follow up a little bit with this tree forest idea then. Um, I, if you build a microforest and cut down all the trees on the streets, would that still say that the city has the equivalent tree coverage, but it's not helping the people on the streets lower
Mhm.
their temperature?
Mm.
Versus, so if you have a tree every 10 feet or 15 feet
Mhm.
going down the boulevard, and so you're walking and shopping and you're under shade the entire time, versus having that same number of trees in a microforest, which is 3 miles away and nothing on that boulevard. If it's counted the same for tree coverage for that city, I think you're losing a lot of fact as to how much good it's doing.
Mhm.
So that's a
Yeah.
concern I have.
And I think it
Um,
is also it's an evolving program, if that makes sense. And I think it's meant in their case to supplement for things like sequestering carbon. Maybe it's not necessarily so much of the heat control. Maybe it's sequestering carbon, and there is ways that trees also help to, like I was talking about, making more areas more energy efficient. Maybe it's not just about this open pavement versus shaded pavement. You know what I mean? But
okay.
that's a really interesting question.
And then also, you said that you sort of pre-make the ground better, but the whole purpose of a microforest also is to help regenerate the soil.
Hmm.
So can you build these little microforests on what are currently brown fields, which might be is such badly the soil is so unhealthy that you can't build a building on it without completely uh,
Hmm.
working that ground.
Right.
Can we be planting these microforests on that land the way
Hmm.
they are, or do we have to first pre-work the soil?
Yes, there is a process. Again, it's a case by case basis. So if you're looking at something that's heavily degraded, there is a ratio of things you're adding in versus what's already here. So you could take the degenerated soil, and it's going to be 3 times this amount is going to be biomass that you're putting in. It's going to be your compost. It's going to be your straw. It's going to be you
Make
can
it,
buy soil microbes and add them to this, but at a certain point, you do have to do some of the supplementing
so you have to
to make
mitigate it
sure.
first.
Right.
Okay. And then also, can these microforests be designed to be food forests, real food forests, where the trees are maybe nut trees, that kind of thing? And,
Mhm.
you have herbs, you have edible plants, you have mushrooms, so that people from the neighborhood can go in and learn how to forage if they want to.
That's I think when you start to talk about that, it's more of you want to look at efficiency. So if you're looking to get the most food out of an area, that's going to want to be more of a community garden
No, I
situation.
don't want that. I want
Okay.
a forest, but like the indigenous people use their
Mhm.
forests to
Mhm.
forage for food. And in South America, there are still a lot of tribes that forage their food in their local forests. So that's what I'm wondering, if when we're planting like a ground cover, can we be planting edible ground covers
Yeah.
so that people can go in and uh, eat their porcelain, which is a
Mhm.
ground cover, and
Yes.
learn how to actually use the forage things. And
Mhm.
so we help to alleviate some of our food deserts by planting micro
Yeah.
forests.
I think as long as they're native to here, I see no reason why those could not have a place in this. If it can fulfill one of these layers, it can be part of it. I think that as long as it's a native thing to here, there's certainly you put mushrooms in your microforest, as long as they are growing in a nearby area to here and they're flourishing naturally in a space nearby. I think absolutely.
Okay, Rick, yeah, your turn.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very nice presentation. Um, I'm on the planning commission in Portage, and the topic of green space, wooded areas comes up quite often. And then it turns out that, I mean, the property around neighborhoods are privately owned, and
Mm.
how do you get a community to um, put in some kind of type of a microforest like this. So
Right.
is the land publicly owned in these cases that you were talking about, that they can actually build a forest? How do they get the land?
Yeah, in the examples I looked at, like I was talking about, this was piloted in Thailand actually. But some of them were publicly owned. They were like you'd think of like a Bronson Park, and this was a community supported. People voted in favor of this. People said, yes, we are okay with this. But sometimes it is privately owned land. If you have a big enough backyard that this is something you'd be interested in. I mean, you see native lawns starting to pop up around here. This is something that is it could be someone's own will and it could be their contribution to a community. So I think it could be either way.
Your your picture at the end, your thank you picture, seems like a pretty big plot of land. I don't know. That's maybe not typical. Did you say the typical size might be 10 by 10 meters
That's just minimum. These can be,
minimum?
even though it's called a micro forest, they can be, if you got the space, use the space.
Okay. And the when you were mentioning temperature differences, different communities, you expressed that in Celsius. And I was wondering if that was intentional, or not expressing it in Fahrenheit, or maybe it's just the data you were using.
Yeah, they kind of varied. I noticed that as well. They do vary between studies that I looked at because some of them were comparing international data to our data. But I think I had one that mentioned in specifically in Philadelphia, they found a 13-degree difference in Fahrenheit, and then in the overall and finding the overall average of the 13 different cities, specifically in America, compared to I think it was London, there was a 5 degrees Celsius difference in those previously redlined area versus previously greenlined areas. But that was just discrepancy in study.
So Nikki, just to clarify, you want to grow food on brownfields? Is that what you're talking about?
That's what I'm talking about. If we can grow microforests on brownfield land after a relatively minor mitigating to make it soil that the forest would grow in, could we make it a foraging forest? I don't know if it would be safe or not. I don't know if any studies have ever been done about yeah, I mean, we had so many chemicals just to our agriculture that I'm not sure a brownfield would be any worse.
Well, I know that they don't allow food to be at least sold for human consumption that's grown on brownfields because of, various types of contamination where heavy metals, for instance, can be taken up by the plants and
Right.
into the food. I know that at KVCC they had to build raised beds out at the Innovation Center because the whole site is a recovered brownfield.
Marianne.
Amelia, is there any difference between a microforest and a pocket forest?
I think that they're kind of similar names for, or it's like the same name or different names for similar things. I would say microforest, there is definitely a more, there's a formula to this. There's a strategy, this Milwaukee strategy. It really emphasizes this, you're simulating a natural forest, whereas where we see these small green spaces, it's like you have the maple tree and you have a bench and you have, you know what I mean? It's more it's less supposed to be, it's less of a simulated wilderness than I think a microforest is. But they are contributing to the same thing. They're working, they're solutions to the same problem.
Yeah, and I have the sense that they might be synonymous. The reason I was asking is that the Ann Arbor chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby is hosting a program that Doug Twalmy will be moderating or in charge of on pocket forests. And I know that chapter, because Citizens Climate Lobby has healthy forests, building
Yeah.
and maintaining healthy forests as one of our policy initiatives. They are developing 3 pocket forests in the city of
Yeah.
Ann Arbor. So
Yeah.
Well, it depends on the pocket, I think. Does a pocket forest include shrubs and ground cover or just the trees?
I think it
Well,
I think it's synonymous. I'm not
Okay.
positive about that, and I thought maybe Amelia would know for sure.
Yeah.
I can
Because
even do a quick Google search here and we can find out. Yeah, I think there's the same, okay, so there's this same idea of the regeneration of soil. That's another thing that I see between both of these. So I'm sure there's a lot of overlap in the strategy and also in the goal oriented of both of these projects. Thank you so much for having me.
Deb, you have a question?
I do have a question. I'm wondering, Amelia, if you're willing to do presentations for other groups on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
I did one at the end, like I mentioned, this is a compilation of some research from last year as well. And we did one at our end of year CTE program, and I really enjoyed it. And I would be happy to bring this elsewhere.
Yeah, I really liked the way you touched on the redlining in the very beginning of it as a little primer. Not that I think all of us needed that part, but for a lot of other people that aren't real familiar with the redlining, I think that's a really valuable piece of the presentation to go over that history first.
Right.
So yeah, I can think of a lot of organizations that would really like to hear this presentation. And unfortunately, we had kind of a small audience today.
It's okay. I'm happy you guys were here.
So it is past our normal 1 o'clock by just a few minutes. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you all.